Tonight's program is 100 years of the Detroit Historical Society. Since its founding in 1921, the Detroit Historical Society, DHS, has been dedicated to safeguarding the history of our region so that current and future generations of Metro Detroiters can better understand the people, places, and events that help shape their lives. The book captures in words and photographs little-known story of the people who have been telling Detroit stories and preserving its material culture for the last century. DHS became the primary support organization for a new municipally owned and managed historical department, resulting in multiple facilities and storytelling capabilities. Later, the changing social and fiscal priorities, nice way of saying budget problems, prompted the Historical Society and its partners to adopt new strategies for interpretation, funding, outreach, and inclusion. Eventually, they would assume stewardship of the Detroit Historical Museum and Dawson Great Lakes Museum, bringing new momentum to the regional public history. Over 100 Grosse Pointers have either been members of the staff there or on the board of the DHS over the last century. Our speaker tonight, Joel Stone, retired last year and was named Curator Emeritus of the Detroit Historical Society, which I suspect means that you're now going in and volunteering and not getting paid for what you used to do, right?
I still get to keep my free parking place down in Midtown.
Anyway, Joel has edited several books, including Detroit, 1967, Origins, Impacts, and Legacy of the Riot or Uprising, and authored Floating Palaces of the Great Lakes. As many of you will recall, Joel has been a Bicknell lecturer 3 previous times: March 19th, 2014, Crossings the Detroit River Region in the War of 1812, September 20th, 2017, Detroit 67, Origins and Impacts and Legacies, and October 16th of 2019, when we had 80 people stuffed in this room for the Centennial National Prohibition and the Detroit Windsor funnel, right, with what, 75% of the illegal liquor coming from Canada into this area. Joel and his wife live in West Bloomfield, so we thank him for coming across town, and it is my distinct pleasure to once again introduce the incomparable Joel Stone.
Well, that was a great introduction, Mike. Incomparable, absolutely. And I've got relatives, I've got friends and relatives throughout the room. You guys know incomparable is not.
Relatives are also friends.
Yeah, they are, but they know better. Incomparable means a whole different thing to them. So, it was fun. This is a great story to tell, and it's wonderful to come here. As Mike said, you know, lots and lots of Grosse Pointers had a lot to do with the Detroit Historical Society over 100 years, and it really was a lot of fun to get to work this story through. And I'll be discussing as we go kind of the progression of things, and it's a lot of fun pictures. Part of my background was not just working with the Detroit Historical Society, but I'm a museum guy. My folks dragged us around the museums in states, 40 states out of 50 by the time I got out of high school. So it kind of was in my blood. And when I got a chance to get into the museum business, it became something I loved to study. I belonged to a couple of different organizations. Hello, Tim. I didn't see you sneak in. A couple of different professional organizations related to that, but I also got a chance to write or edit a book about maritime history museums. I got to write this book. I edit an online newsletter about museums. Museology is something that I enjoy. So doing this was a real labor of love, something I really enjoyed doing, and I learned a whole lot. And, you know, part of it as we go through was, like many of us, when we go through old family photos, I know somebody who's doing that right now, and it gets you into the story. It really dives in. So you get to find things like this, which was a lot of fun to put together, a juxtaposition of, you know, Round Hall just after it opened, and as it looks today when you walk in. And some things have changed a lot, and some things not so much. And, you know, that was kind of a theme that ran through the story as we went. It really was a family history, just like when you start digging into your own family history. I started digging, and what I found out was there were a lot of relatives, some very, very close and some just shirt tail. You know, we started as an auxiliary with the Burton Historical Collection, and out of that we started getting a lot of other organizations that helped us through the years, the DAR, the Colonial Dames, particularly right at the beginning. But later on, the Maritime Historical Society of Detroit, the Great Lakes Maritime Institute, were, folks that helped us out, including a lot of the local historical societies. I mean, the DHS kind of ended up as an umbrella organization that both helped a lot of local historical societies, but also drew from those historical societies. So absolutely, we're all related in this venture. It also is a story of kind of changing winds in the museum world. Earlier on, what we started with was very common. And then in the 1940s, after World War II, moving into a city-run, city-managed organization with the society as kind of an ancillary, which also was happening across the country. And then in 2006, when Bob and the gang that was kind of running the museum at the time, running the society at the time, was asked by the city, who was suffering financial issues, to step back in and take over the management of the thing. And this also was happening across the country. You go to Philadelphia, almost any of those towns and their local history organizations went through exactly the same thing. So it was kind of interesting to set this up. Unfortunately, a lot of local history organizations have gone through their 100th anniversary, and they didn't get a chance to do a book and actually put all these words together and line that up. So it was really quite an honor to be able to do that. The Society does today what it has always purported to do, is preserve and then promote and present Detroit's history. All three of those things are important. The first, probably the most important, is preserve it. If it goes away, it's gone. And Detroit has, there we go.
There it goes, of course.
Detroit has suffered a lot of that. The Monroe block downtown is no longer there. Once it's gone, it's gone. So the idea is to, capture what we can, and we do that through a massive collection. The beautiful collection, if you've ever had a chance to get down to the Collections Resource Center. We do it through the streets of Old Detroit. I don't think most of you, I didn't know. One of the things I learned, you walk through the streets of Old Detroit, that's not Disney. That wasn't built in a shop. Those were storefronts that were taken out of Hastings Street in that area when it was being leveled. And so this is actually, as you walk through the streets of Detroit, you're walking through the streets of Detroit, which is pretty cool. And just thousands and thousands of photographs, things that we've been able to preserve so that we can then go on and, this is just not running. Here, why don't you give that one a shot if you could. So then we present it. And the obvious way is through the museum, through exhibits that we put on, lectures that we offer. And in fact, that's how really the society got started, was just plain offering lectures, just like we're doing right here. But also getting out into the schools, getting out into the community, like we're doing right here, and getting that stuff. And that's part of the promotion aspect, letting people know what the history is all about, and letting them get involved, letting them know that this is their history and they can get involved in it too. Now we're getting to the fun pictures, and I'm going to need that. There we go.
Now it's working again. Now what?
Whichever one you got in.
Yeah, try that.
All right.
Sorry, everyone.
That's all right.
I've had that clicker for years and never had a problem.
Oh, it's just me.
No.
I'm sure it is.
So sorry.
So let's go back. Detroit Historical Society founded in 1921. So let's go back just a little bit before that to give you a perspective of what the city looked like. This is Campus Martius, Cadillac Square in 1910. And I've looked in that picture and you see some horse carts and you see some trolley cars, but you don't see an automobile anywhere. 1910, so this is, cars are out there, but they're just not down here. 10 years later, the park is gone. In place of parking, and Detroiters have absolutely embraced the automobile. And you guys have been to enough of these lectures, you know what that did for the economy. It absolutely blew it up and it took off. And it was about that time that somebody decided that we really needed a Detroit Historical Society. But we didn't need another club. And I make this point in the book. Detroit was a city of clubs. We had athletic clubs, we had music clubs, we had ethnic clubs, we had religious clubs, we had as many possible, literary clubs, all of those things, theatrical clubs. We had a very vibrant community, and what we didn't need was a bunch of old guys sitting around talking history. We needed something a little more than that, something that was starting to be a caretaker for that history. And, that's kind of what happened when they opened the new library in March of 21. And by that time, Clarence Burton had donated his collection, which you guys I'm sure are all familiar with, to the library. It's a wonderful collection of paper that Burton had collected over years and years and years, to the point where he had built, he lived on Brainerd, down behind Orchestra Hall, had built a huge library on the back of his house, and when that was full, I think his wife said, honey, find a new home for it, and he did, in this building here. And once they got it in there, they started to develop the collection. It really was, it was cataloged in a method that wasn't something we would use today. He hired a young lady who was a friend of his daughter's, Tracy Irwin, to come in and organize it, and she started doing that. And at the same time, he got together with some of his buddies, Debbie Duffield and Albert Finn, and they sent out a letter to like-minded gentlemen, and they were all gentlemen at the time, to get together and start promoting what the Burton Historical Collection was. And the way they were doing that was by offering lectures. But when they were forming this club, back in December 15th, they got together for the first meeting down in the club room there, and Debbie Duffield said, if you're not going to do something worthwhile, let's skip it. Okay, straight out. And frankly, I think we got lucky. I think what we said was, let's make it happen. And 100 years later, we can say that I think we did something worthwhile. So, beyond the lectures, the society grew gradually. It was relatively slow in the beginning. It did start including women, which was great. And because Burton's collection was all paper, archival material, people who were donating that stuff also wanted to donate their great-grandmother's spinning wheel, or the bed that, you know, somebody famous had slept in. And that was not something that could fall into the purview of the Burton Historical Collection. And because the society was there, that kind of became their new mission, was taking care of the material that Burton could not. So the Detroit Historical Society literally became the collectors and the keepers of Detroit stuff. All right? And it started off, J. Bell Moran, famous Grosse Pointers name, had been on the board from the beginning and really lasted right through into the 60s, was president twice. He was a real estate guy, and he got an office in the Cadillac Tower, it was Barlow Tower at the time, 24th floor. And they moved all this stuff in here, and that became what we like to call the highest museum in the world. Okay, up there in the top. And it really was, you've heard the term cabinet of curiosities, they're the cabinets. All right, they actually expanded into larger spaces because they did start getting a lot of people coming by. They had, you know, spinning demonstrations. They had people bringing the stuff they collected, and people collect anything. So they would, you know, they would have buttons one week, and they would have dolls the next week, and they started getting people coming in, and then they started getting Boy Scout groups that were coming in and that kind of thing, and that became a problem because you had to get up the elevators in that 24-story office tower to get up there, and it started to become a problem with management. And it became relatively clear that we needed a new way to go with this. Now this basically got us up to just prior to World War II. And it was really kind of run on a shoestring. The guy who was, what's his name, Arthur Hampton, was the first curator. And the guy was making, in today's dollars, he was making $18,000. So really, he was doing it for love too, like most curators. It was the kind of thing that, you know, he would, when they put on an exhibition at the State Fair, you know, they put out a table with all of the stuff on it, and he was paying for the lunches for the volunteers. He was paying the bus fare. He was paying it all out of his 18 grand. And it really wasn't viable. And it was about this time, J. Bell Moran was the president, and he got a guy named George Stark on board. And George Stark was the editor of the Detroit News. And so he had two things going for him. First, he loved history, loved Detroit history, but he also knew everybody important in town. All right, and he said, you know what, we got to go in a different direction with this. He said, as the war was kind of winding down, and of course Detroit's fortunes were huge, he said what we need to do is get the city to run the museums. That's the kind of thing that should be a civic duty, And he went out and he, lined up the people, this is George on the left there, at a city council meeting. It had to go before the voters, and the voters approved it. And so all of a sudden, we've now created a 4-person Detroit Historical Commission, and they kind of directed the activities of the Detroit Historical Department. And the Detroit Historical Department went on to build the museums and basically run things for about 50 years. This is at the point when the Detroit Historical Society became an ancillary. Okay, it was in charge of raising membership, it was in charge of educational programming, but most importantly, it was in charge of fundraising. And it was the group that would have the events, the parties, the lectures, and any money that they took in would then go to help support whatever activities that the museum was doing. The other thing that Stark really wanted to do and had to do was to get the museum out of Harlem Tower. And what they did was they went to Wayne University, which at that point was part of the Detroit public school system, and they got the head of the history department loaned to them, Raymond Miller, who I, oddly enough, grew up next to up on Fairholme. And Ray Miller came over and he got things started. The first thing he did was get the G-Men and Williams, the house that G-Men and Williams grew up in, which on Wayne State's campus, if you're familiar, it's the DeRoy Auditorium. Kind of sits there with a moat around it, and that's where this house sat. And they got the house on about a 4-year lease, and the DIA agreed to take all of the spinning wheels and all of the art and all the stuff that they collected till they could get in and settle down, and they moved into the house. I threw in the lower picture there, that's J. Bell Moran, with Gracie Crum, and Gracie Crum did a really important thing, and then that's Mrs. Arthur Hampton, and they're looking at a picture of her husband, who was the first curator. Gracie Crum was the secretary for Burton, and so she was at the very first meeting, and she started taking the notes right through 1952. She was, the first woman there, and she was also a big advocate for the women's organization that eventually became the Detroit Historical Society Guild. But it was her notes that were most important. Those notes got lost, but luckily before they got lost, she wrote a book in 1952 that covered the first, 30 years of the Detroit Historical Society. Without Gracie Crum, I couldn't have done this. So I always like to point her out. Anyway, they moved into the building. They had a couple of exhibits throughout the main floor. They had meeting rooms upstairs, and that got them by for a while. But now the word of the society and the department and the commission all working together gets out. People are having some really great ideas. We need a Maritime Museum. Okay, so they went to the Piggott family and they got the JT Wing, last working schooner on the lakes, donated, and figured out a way to clean it up, get it to Belle Isle, and it became the Museum of Great Lakes History right off the bat. There was also another group that said, wow, we've got Fort Wayne down the river. We need to make that into a military attraction. This is a great history that we need to celebrate. So all of a sudden, by the time they actually get things going up on Woodward Avenue, which where we're used to, these other two facilities were already up and running under the aegis of the Detroit Historical Department. And all of a sudden, they've now, instead of one museum, they now have 3 museums. And we've got a brand new logo. So on Woodward Avenue, and this is actually a great picture here to the right, if you get down and you drive into the Detroit Historical Museum and into the parking lot, you'll see that the carriage house is still there. It's our design department and part of our operations facility. It's kind of tucked in behind the museum. It was a children's school, kind of a Montessori type thing, arts and literature for after school hours. To the upper left there, you've got George Stark with William Capp, who was the architect. And when Ray Smith went back, Dr. Smith went back to the Wayne University, they hired a guy named Brown to come in. And Brown had a degree from Albion, and he worked for the National Park Service. And once he came in, he became kind of the new head. And he and Stark worked very, very well together. They were completely different personalities. Stark was an editor, but he wasn't a screaming, shouting type of editor. He was the quiet, shake hands and make things happen type editor. And Brown was Henry Brown was kind of very serious guy. I only found one picture of Henry Brown smiling. He was really into making sure this whole thing worked. So they raised the money, they got some money from the Pike family, who was related to the Elder family, and they, were breaking ground here. Everybody's got these very kind of quizzical smiles on. I think they decided they've now stepped off into the abyss. They've broken ground. Now we really have to build a museum. And they did that through 1950, and it opened in 51 on the 250th anniversary of the city's founding by the French. And it was a highly attended event. It was a big weekend. There was like 4 days worth of events. And the opening of the museum was really just about a 3-hour slot on Saturday. But there was, landings of Cadillac and balls and all kinds of events that went around this. But this was one of the highlights of that birthday party. There's a picture of the very first staff that they had. Henry Brown standing in the middle. And notably about 25% African American staff, which most people don't think of. Come 1966, you can see up in the right-hand corner there, the first part of the museum has been built, but we need more space, we need more exhibit space, we need more storage space and office space. And they were able to go to Sebastian Kresby, who made a very, very handsome donation, and the Kresby Wing got added onto that. So you can see in the lower right-hand corner, that's the second installment. And there really was meant originally that there would be a third wing which would go all the way to Cass. And that the booth house would have gotten, or I'm sorry, the house on the corner, which I'm blanking on the name right now, would have gotten torn down, and we would have had even more museum space. This never quite happened, one of those things that never got there. In the meantime, many things going on in Delisle. Of course, the Dawson family had donated the money to get the new Maritime Museum. Once the JT Wing got old and rotten and burned, they leveled it, they put the new museum in there. The Dawson family were boat racers, so Miss Pepsi, that beautiful piece of mahogany, got set into its own pavilion there. They were able to raise the money to get the Gothic room from the City of Detroit 3 installed. Paul Coletta is still around someplace. It was one of the guys to get that installed in there. Over time, other things happened. We got the anchor from the Edmund Fitzgerald. We were able to get the William Clay Ford Pilot House tagged on over time. It should be noted that these last two things happened with almost no input from the city. The city's historical department was putting a lot of their money into historic Fort Wayne by the millions of dollars a year, and the Dawson had enough money to keep the heat on and to pay 3 staff. And so the Dawson was kind of left on its own, and 2 groups, the Marine Historical Society of Detroit stepped up, but more importantly, the Great Lakes Maritime Institute stepped up, raised a lot of money, both to put on exhibits, but also to get the friends and the people and the money to get the pilot house, get the anchor put in there. So some of those family members, that big family, that big extended family.
And Joel, that anchor was one that was lost when the Edmund Fitzgerald was in the Detroit River. It didn't come out of Lake Superior.
No, that's absolutely true. And that's a whole other story. Maybe we started there. We'll never get to
We'll leave it there, we'll never.
So Historic Fort Wayne was a wonderful feature. The idea, the reason they were putting the money into it, was they saw it as being kind of almost a rival to the Henry Fort. I mean, or think in terms of Fort Michilimackinac, up northern Michigan there. This is a possibility that it could be a destination. There was enough of the fort that was still around that they could really, they could have put in fact, they had 4 different museums. They had a military museum, a children's museum, a Native American museum, and then they had the fort itself with that great barracks building, which is actually in really good shape. They took off, World War II had left all kinds of warehouses over the parade ground here. They took all of that off. This is Solon Weeks at this time was the president of the society, and he is helping, he's the president of the department, and he's helping keep this thing going. So, they took out, made a parking lot here, beautiful era-appropriate lighting, and really Fort Wayne was in pretty good shape. The problem it had mostly was that people couldn't find it, and when they did find it, it was kind of a tough neighborhood, and they weren't necessarily willing to go there. So this next bit's going to be kind of before and now and then. in the exhibits world and what our spaces used to look like. I mean, this is Dodge Hall, named Dodge family gave a nice donation when we were building a museum in honor of John and Horace. And, you know, it basically was a place where they lined up our cars when we had a chance. And if they needed it for a big event, which I'll touch on a little bit later, you get the cars out of there and you've got this beautiful big hall. Except that that wasn't necessarily where we were going when we redid the museum in 2000. Well, they did this, started in 1995. They put in the America's Motor City exhibit, and then we redid it in 2006. So the body drop went in right after Clark Street closed in the 90s, and then we kind of updated it through there. So same space, just a whole different use of that space, much more engaging use of that space. Dawson, very similar, you know, lines and lines of models, which everybody remembers. Lines of models down the center with exhibits off to the sides and beautiful paintings and flags, but that's about all the Dawson was. Back in 2013, we went through and redid that and made it much more user-friendly and a lot more hands-on for kids and frankly, a lot more colorful. There's always been new to the collections in one way or another. This was kind of what they call Collector's Corner, going back to my thought of, you know, everybody collects something, so every month, some collector would come in with their needlepoint or their quilts or their, you know, car hood ornaments or whatever they collected, they were able to show. For years, we had what we called new to the collection because we would get donated anywhere between 50 and 100 things a month. And it was nice to be able to take some of those things and show them to people so that people, you know, those donors could see their stuff in the museum, but people could see what we're getting. And some of these things, this is the handle off of the old stove. It used to be down near Bell Isle and ended up, and that's what's left of the old stove. You folks remember that it burned, right? We got two of the legs and the handle off the front. But it's always been a fun thing. It's just, you know, there's not a lot of thinking to it. It's just fun to look at. It's the eye candy that everybody comes with. Music exhibits. We've been doing this for a real long time. The banjo player with McKinney's Cotton Pickers, and Jim Conway. You guys might know Jim Conway there.
Doesn't look like that.
A great picture. I love the goatee. This is an exhibit about the new McKinney's Cotton Pickers when they revived that in the 1970s. And then next to it is a shot from our Detroit Music Lab. This is just after Aretha Franklin died, and we put it in the exhibit there. And just, and it's kind of tough doing these comparisons because these pictures are always in black and white and they look so flat. And these are always in color and they look so good. These exhibits were really well done. They didn't have the same ability to do the kinds of things we can do really fast. They didn't have color printers sitting right next to their desks. They couldn't get somebody from a distant museum to email them a JPEG that they could then blow up into an exhibit. You know, there's a lot of things that happened in the museum technology world between that time and this time that really changed the story. We've always used the costumes. We've got an incredible costume collection, probably 3,000 different pieces of clothing, counting 2 shoes as a pair, as a one. You know, and this is what they used to call the rooms of distinction or the rooms of patriotism. It went through a bunch of iterations, rooms of tradition. But using, you know, some of the stuff that's all been donated and then dressing up people to kind of give you an idea of what it was like. And we still do that kind of thing. This is a great exhibit we did called Out on the Town, which was dining and drinking in Detroit. And we had a blast with it. But we were also able to bring out all kinds of those great old clothes that we enjoy. We had for a long time an exhibit called the Fab Five, the Fabulous Five. This here is Fabulous Five Theaters. They were in Detroit, but these pictures came from one that was Fabulous Five radio voices or television stars, and they made great parties. The members who always loved coming by these kinds of things, and then the people who were featured would show up, and of course, if you invite Sonny Elliott, you never knew what was going to happen. One of our, probably the exhibit that has won the most continuous awards was a thing we call the Community Gallery, which is now the Bob and Mary Ann Murray Community Gallery. And it was started back in 2006 by Tracy Irwin, Tracy Smith at the time, And it was an idea she had where it was, bring in the 501c3s, bring in the nonprofits that can't afford to put on their own exhibit, and let them tell their story in our museum. It was great, it was the kind of thing that we have always kind of taken a hands-off attitude in. Let them develop the story, we'll help them develop the graphics, we'll help them figure out how to hang whatever their artifacts are or enclose them in vitrines, but it was really always the community group's exhibit. They could put it on and do anything they wanted with it. And some of them have been hugely successful, and some of them have bordered on catastrophe, but never got to catastrophe. Tracy Smith and her team, Gary North, have always figured out a way to make sure that these were exciting and visually positive exhibits that showed the city. And sometimes it's the Boy Scouts, or it's the Humane Society. We've got right now, in fact, the Albert Kahn Foundation is about to open a new one. The Gaelic League just came out. So they're all over the map as far as what we show in there. We've had LGBTQ, we've had Asian community over that many years. Wonderful, wonderful exhibits, changed about every 3 or 4 months. And really, we say that if you want people to see themselves in your museum, put their stuff on the wall, put their words on the wall, they'll get it. And this has been a wonderful way of doing that, and has really, again, it's won a number of awards, and Tracy took it to a number of conferences, and it's been copied in other museums around the country. This one hardly needs explanation, the streets of Old Detroit. This is the one that everybody remembers. I'll go out and do a talk like this, and you'll come up and say, wow, I haven't been there since I was in Cub Scouts. Kill me. But I hope it gets you back when I show you the picture of it and say, this is the part you enjoy. This is the part you've always come down to see the museum for. It's the part the kids enjoy, still come back. We also kind of cheat. We put the Glancy Trains exhibit, another Grosse Pointer, Glancy Trains exhibit right next to it. So if the kids aren't enthralled by the streets of Old Detroit, they are indeed enthralled by the Glancy Trains. And I pointed out earlier that, this oriel window or bow window, this was actually a part of the streets of Detroit, and it's nice to know that that's down there. I don't think until I discovered some of these photos that anybody who was working there knew that. We've now got a new didactic panel up that describes that. Programs have always been a huge part from our beginning, lectures and that kind of thing, but at Christmas time, there were always big gatherings of choirs that would come in, and of course the parents would pack the seats. I remember Tom Bailey at high school, Austin High School, a couple Austin guys here. Tom Bailey used to always have a huge cast in his plays because then you could be sure the house would be full.
There's a couple Dardan guys here too, right?
Yeah, all right. We used to have these big book fairs, huge book fairs. They'd get 50,000 parents and kids through there in about 3 months. The ladies of the guild loved taking the costumes and dresses that we had and putting on fashion shows. Every year, these were big, big fundraisers. Until the point when we had to say, you know what, these things are too delicate. We can't do that anymore. But there's a TV camera right here. These guys are down at WWJ putting on and promoting the Detroit Historical Society. We also kept up a series of cast lectures where we had, historians from the Midwest mostly that would come in and put on a lecture, and then we would publish it. Those programs are still going on. They just look a little bit different today. We do lots and lots of lectures and programs down in our auditorium, the Booth Auditorium. For a long time, we had a storytelling group, a musical storytelling group, that would go out into the schools and bring the stories of Detroit out there. You might recognize some of these guys. Jim Perkins, there's Robert Jones from WDET, and Josh White Jr. was part of that crew, getting the folk music of Detroit out there. Programs at the Dawson. This is a great one we did last year where we brought in a bunch of high school kids, and they started with raw wood on Monday, and on Friday they were putting their boats in the water. That was pretty darn cool. Our Lost Mariners Remembrance we do every year on November 10th, the date that the Fitzgerald went down. And then we also usually have programs that go with the current events that are going on. So when the NAACP and the UAW is celebrating its 50th anniversary. There's some people in that picture I think you'll recognize. They came to Detroit to celebrate what was going on when they were at the museum. And we also have, with all of our big exhibits, we have tours that you can get either for a small group or with a school group that go around and can explain. We try to make most of our exhibits self-explanatory and self-leading, but if you want a tour, we can also give you that too. Education has always been top of mind. Once we got the museums, once we get the cabinets of curiosities, bringing kids in, this is a wonderful, great diorama of what the city would have looked like had we gotten the Olympics. I sure wish I knew where that diorama went. Is that cool or what? Put a couple of model trains around that thing, it'd be really cool. But also just bringing in the kids and getting the kids hands-on with what was going on. We had one time even the city bought a bus, the History Mobile, and would either take the show on the road and go out to the schools or use the bus to bring the kids in for the schools that couldn't afford it. And more recently, getting the older students, teenagers, and young adults involved in what's going on at the museum. Hugely important if we want this to keep going for another 100 years. And again, the Dossins do a great job getting the kids down into the old Kresby building or in the America's Motor City there, the Frontiers to Factories. These are kind of our core exhibits that we run 3rd graders and 7th graders through. Our collections are huge. We've got one of the bigger collections in the country for a municipally owned collection. You may have heard of the bubble cars down in our warehouse down at historic Fort Wayne. Oh, I wasn't supposed to tell you that. Down in our secret warehouse downriver. We've got about 60, 65, 68 cars in the collection, but at any one time, half of them are off in other museums, which is great. They don't do any good in the warehouse, but when we do have them in the warehouse, we've got these wonderful bubbles that go around them and keep the dust off and keep the vermin out and keep kind of a temperature control situation. But also stuff, aviation history with the Bill Stout collection, for those of you into that. I mentioned the costume collection is huge. Our painting collection is massive, and we're looking forward to reorganizing that in the next couple of years.
We?
Me and him.
So emeritus does mean you're still going.
Yeah, it does, but I'm not getting paid for it, right? No meetings, no keys, no paycheck. That's the best part. But one of the coolest things in our collection are the pictures we've got. Thousands and thousands of photographs of Detroiters. And every type of Detroiter, every different gathering of Detroiters. Most of these are up on our website. If you go to the detroithistorical.org and click on collections, this is all searchable, as well as ship plans, some of our historic maps, all of that stuff is up there. A lot of programs from theaters. There's just a lot to see. If you get a chance, go and take a look at it. We, for a long time, did not make any money on our collection. And then when the society took over in 2006, which I guess I skipped right over, the Detroit Historical Department had been running things for a long time. And Solon Weeks, followed by Maud Lyons, did a wonderful job of keeping that trade on the track. But eventually the money just started getting less and less, and the staff started getting less and less, and the ability to change exhibits got less and less. And then the city came to Bob and said, can you help us run this? Can you help us manage our assets? And as I understand it, he and Sandy McMillan didn't hesitate, and they took it on and they ran with it. And I think it's been a wonderful partnership, and it really has, now partnership may be the wrong word because we're kind of steering the bus, not to mix metaphors, but one of the things we did when the society took over is try to monetize the collection in a good way. Make all these photographs available, films. We've been doing a lot of digitizing of films. And, there was a long period there where Detroit's been kind of cool. People from Germany, from Japan, France are constantly calling, asking questions about our history. Whether it's Prohibition, which because it's the 20s is hugely popular again, but the car companies and just the whole urban revitalization. And we've now got footage that we can sell them, and we're happy to. It really brings in quite a large nut to the society that we didn't have before. So figuring out a way to not only preserve these things by digitizing them, keeping the originals, digitizing them, getting them up where people can use them, whether it's somebody in a class or it's somebody from the BBC. And the class, if the kid wants the picture, he can use it. If the BBC wants the picture, they can buy it. And that's worked out very well for us. We've also done over time a lot of different periodicals. One of the things that saved me putting this together was the Detroit Bulletin. It was basically a bi-monthly publication, one monthly to begin with and then bi-monthly later. It came out and talked all about the staff and all the exhibits they were doing and all the meetings they had, the awards they had won. That was really a big part of getting the base of the story for the book together. We also had a bunch of different topics. These things were put out and sold in our store. The Detroit Perspectives is much like the Michigan Perspective magazine that's out there today. Basically a peer-reviewed journal. Other publications, Henry Brown had something to do with the Cadillac book, and of course, a couple of the books that we worked on more recently with the Society. But getting this stuff out there, scholarly publications has always been an important part of what we've done. And I mentioned right off the bat, the hardest part, the fundraising. The best part about being a curator, and Bob will laugh when I say this, is that he had to raise the money and I got to spend it. And honest to Pete, that was the hardest thing, and the most fun we had were the annual balls, the Detroit Historical Society balls, which started back in the late 80s. I think the first one was at the newly renovated Wayne County courthouse when they had just gotten it back into shape. And over time, they were held at different venues around the city, and we always tried to pick something that was 50 years or older. And they went to some extraordinary lengths. We had a ball in Shed 3 at Eastern Market. It was a blast. They had a ball down at the airport, the city airport. I mean, they have taken spaces that weren't intended for that kind of event and turned them into, we had one at the Velodrome recently. That was a blast. Great ways of doing that. We've also had them at some of the artistic places, the Fisher Building and things like that. Really, really creative ways of raising money, and sometimes up to $500,000 a year. And there's a picture there of Bob and Sandy McMillan and Doug Dawson getting a check from the Port Authority, the Detroit Port Authority, for the Dawson Museum. And the event, Michelle Waddell there, the event down just before the parade starts on Thanksgiving Day. It starts right at the museum. Come on down and have some hot chocolate, sit on our bleachers and watch the heads before they actually put the heads on. Always kind of fun. And then the money they brought in thousands of dollars to raise the Edmund Fitzgerald anchor. Leadership has always been hugely important, and this is probably in the early 50s. But there's at this point there's at least 4 or 5 women at the table. Still mostly old white guys, but there's some women coming into that process. Robert Wright, the first African American who was hired when the museum was first opened as a curator and preparer. Solon Weeks with Phil Mason. Phil Mason's the guy that wrote that great book on rum running. He was a professor at Wayne State University and got the Ruther Library started. He also got the local history conference started. So Phil Mason, one of our heroes. You might recognize a few of these guys too. Kevin Broderick, the local. Dick Stroger, the local. John Booth. Let's see, there's Bob and Marion Burry, I think. There we go. Sandy McMillan. Twice, that's right. Rick Maud Lyons up in the corner. Rick Ruffner and Tom Buell, some of my heroes in keeping the Detroit Historical Society going. And then you got to mention the volunteers. The Women's Guild, the Detroit Historical Society Guild, ran our store for years as a volunteer effort to bring in extra money. Down at the CRC, we have volunteers working all the time. Tim Mayton, who's sitting there in the white coat. I'm just going to point him out because he's a really shy guy. Tim knows more about hydroplane racing in this town than anybody I've met. And we've got an incredible collection of hydroplane photos. And you know what they look like? They look like 2 little boats about that big going that way. And that's it. And Tim will pick that up and say, yeah, probably third heat Saturday, 1963. And damn if he isn't usually right. Okay, those are the kind of volunteers we need. And then just volunteers at all of our events. People pointing the way to the bathroom to make people feel more comfortable. Staff has always been important, and we've had some wonderful staff that have moved on to many, many different positions over time. Let's see, Rita up there is a Grosse Pointer. And these folks, some of these, I mean, obviously, we have some fun when we do these kinds of things, or we used to. I keep saying we. I'm working on it, okay? That retirement thing comes hard. But we just, Tracy Irwin here, we did a racing exhibit called Velocity, all about the different ways Detroiters raced. And we had that little car for kids to get in and get their picture taken. And Tracy's not a very tall person, so she was able to get in. She's celebrating this year, she's celebrating 20 years with the Detroit Historical Society. And I love the one, Gary North up in the corner, one of our exhibitions people, he's Atlas. He's my hero. And, you know, the staff meetings, constant conversation, but most good organizations have that kind of thing. Over time, we've won lots and lots of awards. As soon as Henry Brown stepped in, they started winning AASLH awards. After about 4 years, he was the president of the American Association for State and Local History. But recently, most of this happened within our lifetime. This is the stuff we won for various exhibits that we've done, various publications we've put out. The Detroit Historical Society has always been at the forefront of the nation's medium-sized museums. AASLH is for the medium size. The Henry Fords don't belong to that organization. The Library of Congress does not belong to that organization. It's made for organizations like us and organizations like you. I don't know if you guys are familiar with AASLH, but it's basically to put tools in the hands of smaller organizations that don't necessarily have the wherewithal. In fact, we just won one from the Motor City Heritage Group for our exhibit Still In, if you want to get down and see it, about Fisher Brothers. You know, just always having fun. And it really was fun. It was like telling a family story. There's the good parts, there's the bad parts, there's the uncle that you really didn't want to put in the book, but you had to. You know, it's a huge family, and happily it continues to grow. We continue to get people that support us, like you. The organization continues to support organizations like this, and that's, I think, what the whole thing's about. Mike asked me to bring some books. I did bring some if anybody's interested in buying them at $25. I can only take cash or a check because I don't have a swiper. But I think you can get them on Amazon.
What's an extra 10 with your signature on?
I think it's $10
It goes
off.
off.
Just destroys it, like driving your car off a lot, right? Because when you get it new. You can also get them through Wayne State University Press, who published it, and I say that with the utmost respect. Wayne State Press has worked with us on a couple of different projects, and when I went to them with this, they didn't even hesitate. They took it and ran with it and did a beautiful job with it. So you can also get it through the Detroit Historical Society store online. It's out there. So, but it was a lot of fun, and it was great fun to be able to come out here, especially in Grosse Pointe. So many of the people that made the Detroit Historical Society work, Detroit, Dearborn, to the north, Birmingham, Bloomfield, this side of town, certainly the Grosse Pointes played a huge part in that. So really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk.
Questions? Please.
I guess that means I did my job. Oh, sorry.
I know it's not at the museum, but the Burton Collection at the library, do you know if it's ever going to open again, and how much damage was done to the collection?
I don't know. I've talked with Mark a couple of times, and it hasn't come up, and frankly, that worries me. And I don't want to read too much into it, but when nobody says anything, it's kind of scary. I think there ought to be a little more information. I wish there was, and I can't answer that. They are making stuff available. They had problems not only in the flooding last summer, but a few years before. They've got the National Automotive History Collection down at the Skillman Center, and they had a busted pipe, which I don't think did too much damage, it just made access to the building tougher. Mark and his staff, Mark Bowden runs the special collections, they are doing their utmost. If you've got a request, you just send it to them, and it may take them a week or 2 weeks or a month. It may take them a little while to get it to you, but they will make it available to you if they can. But to answer your immediate question, I don't know what the extent of the damage was.
Anything good happening with Fort Wayne?
You certainly can see it from the new bridge.
Well, there had been some talk with the new bridge that it might become like a Michigan Welcome Center. And there were a lot of suits walking around about 2 years ago, and then they stopped walking around, so I'm pretty sure that's not happening. And I heard through the city folks that the mayor is really intent on kind of developing it further. It's like everything, all it takes is money. The fort itself is in really good shape. In fact, before they started building the bridge and driving heavy pilings and changing the structure down there, they wanted to get a baseline for it. So they had some engineers come in and do a study of the fort itself, and it's in really good shape. The main barracks is in really good shape. They just updated the bathrooms in the visitors center. But that may have another story tied to it, which I think is in the developing process.
Wasn't there some talk of National Park Service?
Or a state park,
Yeah, there was. And actually, the National Park Service has been trying to move into urban areas. They realize that all of the big parks are out west where people of certain means can't get to them, may never see them. So I think that was part of the impetus behind building the River Raisin Battlefield. Down in Monroe, because that was kind of right between the Toledo population and Detroit population, so that was kind of a move in that direction. And I believe there are still talks going on with the folks at River Raisin to do some programming at Fort Wayne. Where that stands, I don't know. I mean, I did kind of walk away 8 months ago, and I haven't. I've kept low profile. So while I do go down there, and I'm going down there tomorrow, I'm not asking any questions.
No other questions? Wow. Well, you got autographed books at least, but thank you all for coming. Hope you can join us next month at the Excellent Eleanor Ford House. Thank you.